This is Eventual Consistency, and I'm Jason, the show's producer. Ross sat down with today's guest, so I'm here to set up the conversation. I'll be back at the end to wrap it up. So everyone split AI into two separate questions. Can the model do the task, and will anyone actually let it run? Ross's guest today thinks that split is mostly false. His argument is that for anything headed into production, capability has to include whether the thing can prove it's reliable again and again, while a customer is watching. A system that nails a demo but can't show that isn't capable yet in the sense it actually matters. Trust isn't a layer you bolt on afterwards, it's part of the job that the system has to do. Matt has spent the last couple of years testing that idea for real at his company, Welocalize, where a wrong output can cost you the account, so there's just no room to just assert that something works. He's had to make it provable. Here's Ross with Matt Sekac.
Matt, welcome back to the podcast. Can you start by introducing us to the agentic AI implementation that you've been helping to lead at Welocalize?
Absolutely. So it's basically around the management of the projects, right? So the actual production of translated localized outputs, that does involve AI in a couple of different ways. But this agentic AI initiative is aimed at like project task management, and specifically where it was too varied for rules-based systems to handle, or at least to handle at scale. So what we did was to go and like pretty extensively inspect what was actually going on in the population of project managers in the delivery organization. Like, what does it actually take to take an order and get it to delivery? And we even went so far as to kind of conduct, you might call it like an ethnographic study, like literally just to observe a lot of folks just doing their jobs in order to see what's really going on. And what we found is this variation across clients and across programs. And so what that means is different customers have different requirements, different customers have different expectations that we have agreed to along the way, you know, often in the interest of kind of, you know, wanting to provide a sort of white glove bespoke service. But then even within customers, of which there are hundreds, right, you have different programs, which are sort of different workflows, different content types, different materials that have different requirements that might require client-side validation, that might require an additional layer of review, whatever it might be. And that those in turn had bespoke requirements. And so what we found was if you look at any one thing, you would say that could easily be automated with a rules-based kind of old world before Claude agent, right? Or like before LLM agent, right? But there are just too many to really think you could realistically just like put your head down and brute force your way through all of them. Like, not only would that take forever, but then you would have this mountain of technical debt, right? You'd have hundreds and hundreds of agents that were sort of like bespoke to this one specific requirement. And so the unlock was, well, you know, the famous like quip, like the coding language of the future is English, right? If you can establish a framework where you can just give plain language instructions to agents on how to, on what to do, then you can, with a whole lot less technical debt and kind of one centralized platform, you can enable a whole lot of variation, right? And you can potentially address that with automated agents. Now, there's still a whole lot of work to do to actually make that real, right? But where if the actual cost center is like coordination, right? It's you know, the actual production of the outputs is kind of like just a buy-sell spread, right? But the actual cost center for our organization is like the fixed cost of like coordinating and executing and stewarding all of these projects, thousands and thousands, a huge volume of projects against the amount of revenue that we have, right? It's work rules and routing and exception handling and all of that stuff. It's can we build agents and use their reasoning capability to absorb these things? And that does change the job for the people around it and what they're doing, what's expected of them. It's not just what the software does, but that's kind of the idea.
Yeah, so that makes sense. And just to sort of ground it in your industry. So each of these tasks is like might be, or each of these projects or programs is like a set of localization projects to be done, where which is composed of a bunch of different translations of documents of different types from a source language into a target language across all of these different parameters, with guidelines for how those translations are to be conducted, and what tools are allowed to be used, what type of person needs to be recruited, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of contractual complexity with each client you have internally. But you had an organization, this project management organization, as I understand it, that was stood up around this, that was sort of meant to marshal any individual program or task through that complexity. And so part of like the groundwork that you needed to do was even just understanding the nature of the complexity that you were dealing with, so that you could consider how you would set it up to not only like operate the clients and programs and tasks you have in existence today, but also, to your point about technical debt, set it up so that you can onboard new clients and new programs and new tasks without having to completely rework the system or stand up a new rules engine in order to make it responsive to those contractual obligations. Am I thinking about that right, or how would you update that?
No, that's good, Ross. Like you understand our business pretty well, right? Like, that's right. I mean, put it this way, right? Like, it ends up that more than half, like the pretty significant majority of tasks, right? Meaning, like, for a workflow to execute a project is then decomposed into tasks, things that need doing. It was already the case prior to this initiative that the majority of tasks were automated through rules-based agents, right? But you were still left with like over 1 million that needed doing, right? That last 30%. And so what had happened was, I would sort of call it like common cause versus special cause, right? We pretty much tapped all of the common cause opportunities, right? Or even like semi-common cause, right? Like, this applies to these 3 clients, or this client is big enough that we can call it common cause because of its scale, right? Like, there are a couple like that where you kind of just do whatever you need to do. But that's what's left is like this huge litany of itty bitty little pieces that are like these special cause requirements. And yeah, the way you described it is pretty on point, right? It's okay, thing comes in, we have to determine like what it is, what the content type is, what resource base it goes to, which resources are sort of skilled or qualified to handle it, right? That might go here, that might go there. Is there anything special about the production workflow that needs to be flagged at the beginning? Is there anything weird about the way that we price it? There's all kinds of stuff like that, to where we had a client with like a 56-page SOP for handling just one program. And when we decomposed that from observation into steps, it was like a 70-row spreadsheet, right? Like, that's to do a project for one program for one customer, right? And so you can go through each thing and be like, oh, you could automate that, but like, are you going to go through all 70 rows and write script an agent for all 70 of them and then like move on to the next and move on to the next? That was sort of the problem. And that's where we think that the agentic capability unlocks a lot of it, because a lot of it is just based on like basic reasoning. That's where it's hard, right? Instead of having to, like, you have to write a rule for this and a rule for this and a rule for this. But if you could just sort of give a heuristic and trust it to apply it, and just write that in plain language, then first of all, it's easier. And second of all, you widen the aperture of folks who can do it. It doesn't have to go through somebody who knows how to write a scripting, who knows how to script an agent, right? It can just be codified in plain language with some guidance by the delivery organization.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So can you walk us through, like, you mentioned the ethnographic study. I would love just hearing sort of like the story of how you went from understanding that complexity all the way up to where you are now in the production roadmap.
The idea was that we knew that there was variation, right? The organization knew that there was a lot of variation. I mean, that was but it was a sort of like abstract truth, right? And so it was okay. You can go and you can ask like this delivery team or that delivery team or this squad or that squad, like, what are your protocols? What documentation? There would generally tend to be like SOPs and some documentation, but then you would hear anecdotally that is maybe not exactly what happened, right? And so that's where the thesis was: let's just sit and watch, right? And let's document, not even ask questions maybe until later, just like let's just see what actually happens. And where are we manually consulting spreadsheet trackers? Where are we doing a thing that actually a rules-based agent already exists to handle, right? And maybe it's not trusted or whatever, right? And let's try to get the measure of like what it would take to automate this. And that was before we had a lot of confidence in an agentic framework. And actually our conclusion at the time was like, we're not really sure there's a whole lot we can do about this because, again, you could do it, but the technical debt. So then it's, as the technology evolved and the capability of agents like became demonstrable, it was, well, let's try it, right? And that's where we had to establish trust along the way, but that maybe we can do what I've been saying, which is, harness the reasoning capability to chunk these like process requirements off, and then sort of couple that with a genuine inspection of whether we need to be doing all of these things still, or is this like we're doing this check of a check because like 3 years ago we messed this one thing up or whatever happened, right? And so we added a check, and then there was another problem, so we added a check of the check, right? If you do both of those at the same time, which is not easy, then you might actually be able to get to something that starts to look transformative.
So what do you think has been successful about the way that you've implemented AI in this context? And, what lessons would you take away for the next time you try to automate a workflow like this?
In terms of how we got from, all right, we're going to try this until today. All right. And what I think was, was successful, and what I think gets at, the theme that you're interested in about trust, right? The way we started was this: we had a hypothesis. So what we did was we stood up a sort of clone mirror environment, production environment. I mean, we put the game on relatively easy to start, right? But we picked, a client and some workflows and some tasks that we thought agents could automate. And we spent about 30 days where we had the agent do the same thing that the human did. So every time a task went to a human, every time like a kind of in-scope task went to a human, we stood up like this kind of shadow environment where we were having the agent do the same thing, and then we compared the results. And the reason for doing that was because in order to proceed further, in order to really like kind of lean in and pour resources into this, we had to, we needed a proof of concept. We needed to demonstrate that it could work. And it was establishing trust with, senior executives, with the leadership of the delivery teams, but like also, and I think this is important, also from us, like we wanted to believe that it worked, right? Like, because we don't want to insist on like just going full throttle until we have some kind of demonstration that like our hypothesis is correct. So from the beginning, we were game planning for what the path was going to look like from this idea, from experimentation, if you want like a callback, right? So this was the experiment, right? And I think this was a pretty well crafted experiment, right? It was yes, to establish like that our hypothesis was valid, that there was at least some set of tasks that we could tackle with a LLM driven agentic, LLM agent, right? And but also that we were trying to do it in a way that the data we gathered would be persuasive from the top on down, right? And so we were trying to anticipate like what the gates were going to be to proceed to the next stage. And so it's okay, look, like we showed with this experiment, it looks like this can work. That gets us through the gate into, okay, now let's pilot it. And then it's pick a couple of customers. You don't want to make it like you were just really kind of like giving yourself the easiest path, right? You also like, is there an opportunity to pick customers where they would have an impact? Are there customers that like are the sort of optimization formula is like you're pretty sure it'll work and there's a really high volume of like manual tasks that you might be able to kind of make go away, right? And we were able to find like a couple of those customers and we tried it on those and it was not without hiccup.
Can you give us some examples of like some hiccups that you encountered?
Yeah, it's one was we have a customer that sends a lot of their requests in as emails. It sort of like bulk orders in emails. And, what we found was that, we just needed some refinement to the parsing. Like it was really like kind of like prompt engineering to an extent. But agents failed in a couple of cases. They kind of like got confused and just didn't yield a result. That happened in a certain number of cases, right? We had some bugs in the code that fired it, right? Like, I mean, just kind of normal stuff, right? I don't think anything super material, nothing that would make you like fear that the whole thing might not work, right? Just kind of sort of normal routine, like, oh, we didn't account for this, we didn't account for that, and so now we have these errors. The human element of it is something that we had to think about along the way, because even now, like everything that an agent does is inspected by a human, right? So like, what's the UI for that going to look like? How much data do we want to gather from them? The more we ask them to give input, the more sort of burdensome that task is, right? And so then it's like, yes, you've made the task go away, but you've added another, and like it, so there's that part of it too that we have to think through. But like, by and large, we've sort of evaluated on the basis of does the agent think it did its job, which is not 100%. Sometimes it's like, I don't know what to do. It's told sometimes to do that, right? I don't think I know what to do. Sometimes it just doesn't succeed. It doesn't like get to the end for whatever reason. And then did the human agree, right? So you have the like, does the agent think it did its job? And then does the human agree that it did its job? And then those are your sort of like, did it work criteria? And so we're going to do that with 2 customers. And then that was successful enough. And that's where like kind of hearts and minds stuff, like the anecdotal feedback from the individuals, that was also part of the selection criteria, candidly. But like the anecdotal feedback from the individuals on the ground who were using it was excited, encouraging, positive. And then it became like a proper, all right, like let's ramp this all the way up if we possibly can. And that's kind of where we are now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm interested in a lot of things, but like how do you visualize the human in the loop portion of this evolving over time, given your point about, the amount of verification tasks that you assign to the project manager needs to be less than the amount of project management tasks that they need to take ownership of earlier.
You think about all of the different types of kind of manual actions that you can apply this to, right? Because there is there's a pretty big population of things. Like they fall into kind of like the Mechanical Turk category, right? That like where historically it's like it's not that it's the most complex thing. It's just that it's really hard to write a rule or to write enough rules to account for it. Where like a human can like pretty easily just like call it, but it's just really hard to get a computer to do it. There's like a lot of stuff in that category, and that is like I think the lowest hanging AI fruit, right? Is where just like the basic reasoning capability like unlocks a lot of that. But also, one of the worst things you can do in a customer relationship is make billing a problem, right? And if so, if some like upstream automation that you put in causes you to bill the customer wrong, then like that, it doesn't take a lot of those to like even like jeopardize the whole relationship, right? You know, so even small things like that, and then it's like, are you going to cause some issue in production? So to answer your question, like, I think what honestly, I don't think we totally know the answer to that problem, right? I think the way we're approaching it is first to try to minimize the amount of time spent on the validation action so that that is at least demonstrably more efficient than having done the thing manually. And for the most part, that's doable for a lot of these things. Even if you rely on like popular, like collective anecdote, but like ideally you're doing it with data. Um, and then it's okay, so can we start to develop mechanisms to maybe have like confidence intervals where like we can say that this class of task based on maybe another agent is doing a quality evaluation, right? Or a sort of like likelihood of accuracy evaluation where if you can show that like, okay, if you get a score higher than this, the human never changes it, then you can start to kind of unwind some of those things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that the way a lot of companies approach the question of what are we going to automate with AI is what is the volume of work that's being done in our business, and they kind of work their way down the list. But roughly speaking, I think of like the cost of error versus the cost of verification, and like if both those things are low, if the error cost is low and the verification cost is low, it's like really, you know, it's perfect for agentic AI because, it's going to have some error rate and it's easy to verify. So you just, throw a human in the loop at it, and it probably removes a lot of their work. But if it's high cost of error, hard to verify, then you're never going to you're never going to get a human out of the loop, to your point about billing just a second ago. So like kind of categorizing where these things fit in that is what I would think about.
Yeah, I mean, I think like where it's like in the more challenging end of the spectrum, you can still think about like, well, are there ways if it's hard, then it's probably complicated, and if it's complicated, can it be decomposed? And so can you facilitate elements of it, right, to like get you faster to the output? That's one thing. The other thing though, Ross, like is I think there's an important thing that's often missed. I think about self-driving cars on this a lot, is like it's important to have in mind like what your baseline of performance is, because the thing about it is the standard should not be perfect, right? It's if you are trying to replace a human process, then the process you're trying to replace is already not perfect, like almost like axiomatically, right? Like because humans aren't perfect, right? And so, I think about self-driving cars because it's like I don't have the data handy on this, but like I'm pretty sure it's demonstrable that like in aggregate, like per mile driven by like a self-driving car, I mean, whatever, okay, more controlled conditions, not everywhere, but you have fewer accidents. But like when there are accidents, when it makes like a dumb mistake or a mistake that like you wouldn't imagine a human making, that like that's just like felt more, right? There's sort of like a bias towards like the way that we react to and we perceive the risk of that kind of outcome, even though like in aggregate you could demonstrate that it's better, right? Like, and the baseline is not no accidents. The baseline is how many accidents there are from human drivers, right? And what kinds of accidents there are from human drivers. And so it's kind of the same thing here where, like, whether it's, I mean, even if it's translation, right? Translators make mistakes too, right? Like whatever it is, it's, you have to benchmark it against a non-zero amount of error in the first place, right? And I think that's hard for people to kind of get used to.
I think that's right. I also think about this as like when we talk about like how much trust there is in a system, like we're so used to trust being sort of like interlinked with responsibility and blame. Like I can trust you because you're responsible for it and you're accountable for it, and I can blame you if it doesn't go well. Whereas when you move from like an individual being responsible for it to a system being responsible for it, it's unclear. And, you know, you go from errors are unacceptable, but we know they're going to happen, to we know there is a proportion of errors that are going to happen, and the system is just going to like make an error sometimes, and maybe we'll improve over time, maybe we won't, but like there's kind of a mind shift that needs to happen there. And so I'm curious what you think about that from like a selling this to leadership perspective, and, you know, and like the desire for control perspective that business leaders want to have. Like, how do you navigate that kind of dynamic?
Yeah, that's good. That's interesting. Because no, it's a good point. I don't think I'd fully thought about it that way before. That like what it is that it starts to feel like you have hard baked in to your expectations that there's going to be an issue. Whereas if it's humans, then it's like you can kind of say that like like when it's computers doing it, it's like, well, the machine's just going to mess up this often. It's math. It like where it's humans, like you can kind of like try to talk yourself into the idea that like they'll keep trying, they'll get better eventually, like it'll be perfect, even though you know that that's not true. Like look, as far as like winning the trust of the organization, right? And like how, you know, what's the difference between trust and capability? Like again, like I basically think that like you can't totally disambiguate them, right? And that like trustworthiness is part of the capability requirement, right? Like it's not like bolted on after the fact. You know what I mean? Like it's part of the deliverable itself. And you know, so in the beginning, you know, with what we did with the agentic framework, like we had to convince senior leadership and the, you know, and the stakeholders in the organization, but also ourselves. But you conceive of what convincing yourself means in such a way as like you anticipate it as being persuasive enough to get you to the next stage. And that's like that's really what I think it is that the capability has to be able to prove itself. And then in popular culture, there is a lot of skepticism toward AI. But I think within an organization, if you're committed to this path, if you do want to try to like unlock this, it's you need to have like human capital that is going to be persuaded by evidence, and where the evidence is genuinely persuasive, like that should establish trust, right? It shouldn't be like a sort of emotional, you know, kind of abstract skepticism. It should be like a, okay, can you prove it works or not? And that's a valid thing, I think, for the organization to ask. That's a valid thing. That's a valid basis for skepticism. But once that bar is cleared, and then that's a negotiation, that's a conversation. Everybody should be a team and on the same page. What does that mean? What does it look like? But we should all be moving in the same direction, right? And the trust is built together, right? You know, with just sort of well-conceived steps of the process where we are like thoughtfully gathering data and not just saying like, I don't know, we think it should be able to do this.
Yeah, I think I have a couple questions on that, but the first one that comes to mind for me, you know, you mentioned sort of gathering evidence and making sure that the nature of the evidence that you're gathering is persuasive. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, how you did that concretely in this project? Like, how did you know what evidence you wanted to gather in advance, and how did you set expectations with your leadership about, what the set of evidence would need to look like in order to prove that you were ready to go to the next phase of, productionalization of this?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'll be candid that like I'm not gonna like sit here and pretend that we've solved all of it so far. Like we've definitely been thinking about it and talking about it from the start. I think our first order set of data was really about, does it seem to have done the right thing? Like, is it not messing up?
Like an accuracy rate? Like you compare the accuracy rate?
You've got humans validating everything, right? So it's like, it's just, did the human say it was wrong or not? Now, like, okay, even that's not imperfect. So, I'll tell you a story. One of the things we tried recently was trying to like, can we put another agent on top of the agent that's doing the work in order to try to check its work? Like, and say like, okay, like these are the ones that are likely to be right. These are the ones that are likely to be adjusted by a human. We actually found that in the first try, but it was inversely correlated, meaning like the more likely it thought that it was not going to be changed by a human, the more likely it was to be changed by a human. So that's bad. It's also kind of flabbergasting, right? Because it's like you're using the same basic LLM technology to follow the instructions in the first place. So then like why when you then ask another one, like, how could it be so wrong? One of the things that we found, though, was that some of the reasons for the override of the initial agent's output were deviations from the prescribed process. We're not supposed to proceed with a project without this information, but we override and do it anyway. That at least is what it looks like. We're still kind of early days on studying this, but like it's and we know that this happens, right? But even in this context where it's like, okay, so like we write instructions for the agent executes them, and then it gets changed, we're counting that as a fail, even though actually it did kind of do what it was supposed to. So you have to go in and inspect that too, right? But like, so there's that. It gets even harder when you want to try to gauge what the impact is, right? Because, depending on like how robust your systems are, like, how reliably can you gauge what the actual like time savings are, what the relative like investment of energy on like having done it manually versus having to validate it. I think what we're starting with is trying to demonstrate as rigorously as possible that we can get the right outcome. And we do have pretty successful results there. And then from there, I think you can start to get into, in collaboration with the business, looking at tasks that are automated. Tasks that are automated versus tasks that are not. And then even if what you have to do is like go watch and see like what it looked like before and what it looked like now, or you can start to come up with ways of trying to estimate those things if you need to.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I think that the challenge, as always, is that, and you mentioned this sort of several times, is that you're going to get nowhere unless you're actually looking at the data and looking at the outputs that the agents are producing, because sort of the, even you if you have a human like in the loop, coming to conclusions over and over again, you can trust that the human is right, but the human is making decisions not just based on what's strictly written there, the context that's on the page that is available to the agent, but based on context that is a superset of that. And so you have like this additional tacit knowledge that you were describing that comes into the picture about how you do business, what this customer actually cares about versus what's written into the contract. Habits that have been developed over time about how you work together with your customers that have never been documented anywhere, but have not made it into the instructions. And so there's all of those edge cases that need to be sort of sussed out by being grounded in the data directly. But then also over time, you're also trying to create firmer and firmer methods of like condensing that information into something actionable so that you don't have to be looking at that data to that degree of detail in order to understand what's going on in the system. So I guess the question that comes to mind for me is like, do you have a feel for what the timeline looks like to I don't know what we would call this, but like take the training wheels off so that you're not having to tightly manage or tightly observe the agentic system for these edge cases that arise?
I think if you ask my bosses, it's like quite fast. We have to figure a lot of this stuff out. I think one thing that's easy to forget is just like how quickly the technology has been developing, where we're having a conversation about like all of this stuff is like established and like long standing, like it's just part of the status quo. But in fact, like, we're what, like we've had like Claude for less than 6 months. Like it's we've been working with the agentic AI for, okay, 18 months, and 18 months seems like a really long time in this world, right? But like that's conceptualize, build, prototype, get to pilot, do pilot, right? It's also a process engineering initiative, right? And I think we talked about this a little on the last podcast, but like the approach shouldn't be to just take everything you've got a human doing and one by one automating it, right? It's as part of this process, you do need to like reevaluate. I think you had the metaphor with the nail, right? Like you have to like reevaluate whether those things are actually necessary to do. Some of them might have been unnecessary to do even without this AI initiative that you're in the middle of, right? As far as timing, like, it sort of depends on like how you would define the endpoint, I guess. Like it's, we've gone from a couple of customers to dozens of customers where we've pretty rapidly scaled the number of projects that this touches into the thousands, right? Like, but because of the original problem, like it still needs to be that like folks in the organization have like the capability and the knowledge and the training, I guess. Like they at least need to be oriented in terms of like how to configure these agent swarms in order to tackle like, more and more chunks of customers in order to automate as much as possible. And then you're also looking at different types of capabilities, right? There's sort of like pre-production activities, which tend to be on the easier side. Then there's like sort of production activities, what resource does it route to? Like in what way does it route to them, those sorts of things. And then there's like kind of post-production activities, and so which of those do you tackle first, right? So it's not just like which customers are you tackling, but which pieces of their workflows are you tackling? So, I mean, I think we're still, well into next year, hustling on this at minimum.
Yeah. Well, it also sounds like in addition to the specific, project management initiative you have going on with agentic AI, there's also a like using this as an example to build up agentic engineering practices internally, agentic platform like capabilities that allow you to apply this across domains, not just specifically to project management. And so this is more of an engineering team problem, but it's, how do we take what we're doing here and make it so that it's repeatable in other domains of the business? Am I thinking about that right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, yeah, ultimately, like what you're looking at are like kind of repetitive manual tasks, right? Which even in, okay, so you compare like current state to 10 years ago, you'd say they look a lot more automated, largely driven by, a material investment in rules-based agents, and where there are like common cause activities that can be automated away, right? But that's kind of true in other areas, not just in like production and delivery for our organization. Finance is an example where like, generating POs and creating new accounts and, our ERP or, going into or just billing and collections, things like that, right? Like those tend to involve a lot of manual activity too. And so you can kind of apply the same lens. I mean, I think another thing is one of the things that I think that this new AI technology does do is it sort of democratizes, it really does like democratize like what a motivated, curious individual like in the business can do, right? It's sort of like curiosity, like data literacy, and a sort of rough technical aptitude. You no longer have as like hard a blocker that just comes from like, was never trained in SQL or Python or JavaScript or whatever it might be, right? You just kind of need to have an idea for like roughly what should be possible and how to, and just the sort of logical thinking, right? And then access, and you can at least kind of mock stuff up, right? That gives us a head start towards like production ready value added tools.
Yeah. No, what you're saying is really interesting. It also highlights for me sort of like the headlines that you see are the gap between demo and production. But I think what that's framed as AI doesn't do what it says it's doing. But I actually think that there's the numerator and the denominator of that equation. There's the number of demos that get produced in order to demonstrate value from different use cases, and then there's the quantity of production of use cases that ever make it into production. And I think that you would expect from what you just said that if more people, if the entrepreneurial, scrappy, and curious business user has the ability to create more and more of these demos to demonstrate value, then the fact of the matter is, even if that person has a 10% hit rate, but they still produce 10 demos, if one of the things that they create makes it into production, then you as a business are in a much better place than you were otherwise. What do you think about that proposition?
Well, I think one thing you have to be careful about in that framing is that can go wrong in that direction too, right? Like that can get into like, it's not exactly AI slop territory, but like one of the, I don't know if you've observed this, Ross, but like one of the things that does end up being a little bit of a challenge with the ability of like AI to generate like nice looking, pretty high quality content so quickly is you end up with a really lot of nice looking, high quality, or at least seemingly high quality content, but which might have like little errors. It's hard. I mean, it's hard for the person who produces it to really like spend the time to consume it. And then they're distributing it and then they have to consume it. And it's like, you end up with just like a lot of content to consume. Right. But like, I think you're right. I think like, I think what you're hoping is that such a user would first self-screen their kind of like brainstorms. But I think that the more important thing is, when we say demo, what we mean is something like closer to done than what we would have meant by demo before, right? Demo before might have been a PowerPoint presentation that I like visually mocked up, or I'm using one of the tools that are out there that let me like sort of like hypothetically stage a click through, right? And that takes a long time to prepare. And it's not actually coded in any way that is like connected back to, whatever underlying database or system it needs to work off of. Whereas like you can like mock up the thing, it's almost done, right? And then like all that's left is, I mean, hell, you might be able to deploy it. Now, we have examples of that, like automating certain processes where it's like all we have to do is enable a connection or enable the ability to like make a write through the API to Workday on like a certain fixed set of records. And then now like this thing that used to take a long time. And this is a sort of citizen developer, right? But here's an automation that like you put the stuff in, and then it goes and it creates these artifacts that we need in Workday. And it does that quickly, right? And it's done, right? It's not like a mock-up or a demo. You demo it and then like what's left is permissioning it or provisioning it or like making sure that the API is enabled, right? There's stuff like that. I mean, I think for a product manager, like this full stack PM concept, right? Like they can almost like prototype. They can pretty much like prototype the story, right? And then, the engineer still needs to validate that, like, it complies with the rest of the code, that it absurdly, that it fits into the broader like tapestry of our code base and stuff like that. But you can your demo is like a thing that works. That I think is like, it's not like so much the volume of things, it's the quality and realness of them that, it either makes them more persuasive, it makes them more likely to get on a roadmap, but then it also is more of a head start.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It also highlights for me sort of why the nature of the business that you're operating in, and sort of the extent to which your systems are architected to sort of give the people doing the work visibility into the entire workflow, and the opportunity to experiment in this way is also another another consideration that companies have to have when they think about the way that they design their roles. Like, is there meant to be the flexibility to experiment inside of this role, or is the role sort of the recipient of whatever the AI workflow is? But are there aspects to this that you think are the most important things that you're trying to learn over the next year as you think about, improving the efficiency of the work you do at Welocalize, or, improving the quality of the implementations that you do from an AI perspective?
I think that, like, when we get into really trying to do this, it really is like about trying to think in advance about how you're going to know if it worked. And we've really tried to do that, but then, you hit unexpected snags, and it's all, a lot of it is like details, right? And that's the thing, is like, you need to be steeped in the details. It's hard to do this kind of thing in the abstract, right? And I think that's sort of across the board when it comes to anything you're trying to develop for an organization, is like, the more it's done in a vacuum, the more likely it is to like not be accepted or used, or adopted, because there's some misalignment in understanding, right? You still have to know the business you're serving, and the better you know it, the more you can, anticipate objections or sources of mistrust, right? But really, just like, what's the best way? You're not just trying to build a thing. You're trying to have an impact on the business with the thing. And so you really want to try to think about how the thing you're setting out to build is actually going to have a demonstrable impact. And if that means you think you can anticipate objections you're going to have to overcome, or resistance you're going to have to overcome, which are probably often valid, you satisfy yourself first, and then the leadership, and then the line level, right? But you want to think all the way through that, because if you don't have that, you're going to find yourself in a tough spot where, like, okay, you can have strategic insistence from the top on down, but then you better be right? Like, and so I think we've done a reasonably good job about that, but it is hard to measure the impact of a lot of these things, particularly depending on, like, how your pre-existing data structures and like enable you to set a baseline. We don't want to do that without data, and it can require some creativity to come up with, like, how you're going to how you're going to like structure your experiments or gather information along the way. And the more that in the beginning, it's like, I don't have this data that I know I'm going to need. Do I have an opportunity as part of this to start gathering it? Because I'm not going to make this decision in 3 months. It's going to be 6 months, like, but 6 months will be enough data. So can I just start gathering it now, knowing that it's not going to be useful for half a year, but I'm going to want it? Thinking about that, like, from the beginning as much as you can. You start at the beginning and the end with things like this.
No, the term that gets thrown around is evals-based development. And so, like, understanding how you're going to evaluate yourself and how you're going to capture the information to evaluate yourself is like a critical precondition for building in the first place. Because if you can't evaluate, then you can't gain the organizational momentum that you need to see something all the way through.
You also can't hold the organization accountable because that's part of it too, right? Like, it's not just all like you evaluating yourself. In the end, it's you're serving the organization, and the organization needs to see value in it. It's not just about like winning them over to something that you think is great. They need to be bought into it, and they need to be signed up and on board with it, because ultimately whatever P&L or business impacts that you're having, like that, they're the ones who have to manifest them, right?
Well, Matt, it's been great to have you on. Thank you for talking about this. Would love to have you on again in 6 or 12 months to talk about, how things are progressing. Because I mean, it like the more I talk about initiatives like this, the more it starts to feel like these are multi-year long initiatives that have to be ushered all the way through, and sort of the conversation about AI automating all work out of existence within 6 months is overblown and difficult to square with the reality of trying to put AI into practice inside an organization like Welocalize.
It's still a business problem, right? It's a business process problem, but with just exciting new capabilities, right?
Totally. Thank you, Matt.
That was Ross with Matt Sekac. The point that really stuck with me most is that the baseline was never 0 errors. It's whatever error rate the humans were already running at. And pretending otherwise is what gets teams stuck, comparing AI to a standard nothing has ever been. What's clear now is that proving a system works, the shadow runs, the human agreement checks, the boring measurement, isn't the overhead before the real engineering starts. It is the engineering. You can find Matt at Welocalize, and if you're the one being asked to prove your own system holds up before anyone will trust it with production, this conversation was for you. If you know a data leader stuck arguing capability and trust as if they're two different problems, send them this episode. And if you think we got it wrong, tell us. You can find us at www.cauldeiron.com. See you on the next one.